Alright, I'm going to apologize in advance for how long this video is about to be. There's simply a lot to talk about when it comes to our wildfire update and forecast for the next few days. So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible, and let's just dive right in. First thing I noticed looking at the satellite imagery is air quality throughout the majority of California is looking very good right now. Super clear throughout the Valley and Bay Area, but there are some areas where you can see some smoke coming up from our fires, especially up here in the August complex, and then especially down here with the Creek Fire and Castle Fire. This is actually the most smoke we've seen in a while. And if we zoom in on that, I would say this is for two reasons. One, the fire behavior in these areas does seem to have picked up in the last 24 hours, but two, the winds right here are relatively weak right now, so that's allowing the smoke that is produced just to sit over the area. Now, you can see that first reason for yourself by clicking into the map here. This shows fire perimeter and where there's some active hotspots and fire behavior. And you can see this has picked up from what it was looking like yesterday. And I'd say especially on the southern edge here. This is burning through some heavy fuels, some steeper terrain. And I know this southern edge is the main priority when it comes to the Sequoia Complex or the Castle Fire. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this in the next 24 hours and see if it still keeps expanding on the southern edge. Now when it comes to the Sequoia Complex, it's up to 144,000 acres and it is at 33% containment. So at least that's some good news there. Now the other fire that was creating all that smoke in that area was the Creek Fire. And if we zoom up here, now, in the past, this was getting shielded by some of that smoke from the Castle Fire, but looking at this map, you can see for the most part, the smoke is just sitting right above the fires and not really moving at all, which makes sense why it's just hanging out in this area. So if we actually look at the Creek Fire here, the first area I'll talk about is this northern and northeastern edge, where you do see a lot of active fire growth. I know this western edge is one of the main priorities today. They're getting some new crews out here to try to get some good containment on the side and stop some of the growth. I would say there's also some good news when it comes to this northern and northeastern edge, as it's starting to burn into rockier terrain where the fuels aren't as thick. The fuels have really just been what's been driving this growth on the northern edge, and the fuels are thinning up here. One, because it's getting rockier, and two, because it's actually starting to burn into an area that has already burned in the past with the Lion Fire. So that's some good news there. Where there is some concern is the winds will be shifting later today to a more southwest direction, so that will act to push this fire further to the northeast. Now, in the southern edge, we have a completely different thing that's leading to our fire growth, and it's what's called a down canyon wind. Basically what happens with this is during the nighttime hours, the bottom of a canyon or a drainage gets cooler, and that causes winds to flow down the canyon, and we see this active fire behavior throughout the nighttime hours. Now, the good news of that, and I'm actually already seeing this based on how this map looks now versus how it looks this morning, during the daytime, that valley heats up, and then the winds shift back uphill. So what that does is has the fire burn back to where it's previously burned, and it allows firefighters to get in there, put some of these hot spots out that we see. And if we actually zoom in there, you can see how spot fires act. Those down canyon winds that we saw last night can pick up some burning embers, throw them in front of the fire, called spotting, and create new little small fires. So again, the good news there, during the day, those winds will shift back up valley, and then firefighters will be able to get some control on the southern edge. Now, if you want to see a perfect example of what that looks like, let's take a look at the WRF S-Fire model here. This is developed by Adam Kochansky, faculty at San Jose State and one of my professors. And this is one of the best wildfire models in the world. It pairs the fire with the atmosphere above it. And I'll pause it here for a second because I want to really point something out here. So if we go back a little bit so you can see what's expected to burn throughout the day today, you can see that there's not that much growth expected today. That's great news. Northern Edge, as I said, is into that rockier terrain, so there's slower growth up here, especially compared with what we had last week. But where there is some concern still, and I will say a disclaimer, this map doesn't take into account fire suppression tactics, so you're about to see a large area show that it's going to be burnt. That's not guaranteed to happen, and I actually don't think it will, but this does provide a perfect example of what those down canyon winds look like. So as of right now, the southern edge hasn't really looked like anything's burned here throughout the entire day today. And typically, fire behavior is more active during the day, but then as we get into 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, you see these winds start to shift down canyon, and then it's showing that rapid fire growth happen. You see the wind vectors pointing downhill, and then that rapid fire growth happening throughout the nighttime hours when fire behavior should be calm. So I'd almost want to just back that up and watch it one more time so you can see those winds shift down and it leads to fire growth. Now again, this doesn't take into account fire suppression tactics, so I don't actually think all of that is going to burn tonight, but it's something interesting to point out. So when it comes to the creek fire, we are now up to 289,000 acres. This has continued to go up, but it's certainly not those 100,000 acres a day that we're seeing sometimes last week and really throughout this entire fire season with a number of our wildfires. Containment is up to 32%, and this is one of the new maps I have for you guys. This actually shows where the containment has happened. I know it's kind of hard to see, so I'll zoom in here. You can see the northern edge. There is basically no containment. The entire perimeter shows up as red, which means that's where the fire is still actively burning. Now, if we go to the southern edge, though, you can see there are some areas of containment, shown with the black lines, around some of these lakes, and especially on this western edge. You can see that southern edge where we're still seeing some of that down canyon growth. You can see that does show up as an area that is still actively burning. So as always, when it comes to the evacuations, check the link in the description. There are too many for me to go over. Damages and losses, I'm happy to say this number has not gone up in the last 2 days. We are still at 855 structures destroyed. Clearly, that is not good news, but it's at least good news that that hasn't continued to go up recently. Now, when it comes to personnel, still over 3,000. We got 40 crews, 16 helicopters, 316 engines, 72 dozers, and 83 water tenders. So that's why I don't think that whole south zone that was showing up burnt right here is actually going to burn. We've got a lot of resources to deal with this kind of growth to hopefully make it so that does not happen. Now, when it comes to the forecast for the creek fire, things are honestly looking great. To put this into perspective, I think it's helpful to think about last week. Last week, the temperatures, we had some days that were in the triple digits. Well, now you can see we're actually below the average for this time of year, and it's going down for the next 3 days. We got 83, 81, 80, and our winds and humidity are actually looking pretty good too. So temperatures going down, that's great news there. When it comes to winds, they're possibly gusting to 20, 25 miles per hour on the ridges, but for the most part, they're relatively moderate, much less than those 40 mile per hour winds we had last week. And it is interesting to point out, it does show up that it's going to switch to that southwest direction. So again, what that will do, when you get these winds blowing from the southwest, it can push the fire to the northeast. But burning into the rocks, so hopefully we don't get that much growth there. When it comes to humidity, I will point out it's staying extremely dry during the nighttime hours. So that's when we have those down canyon winds in the south. That's what's been allowing the south to actively burn because it's been staying dry throughout night. I will point out though, overall, humidity is much higher than it was all of last week. So firefighters should be able to get a better handle on this blaze over the next 3 days as we have some favorable fire conditions. Just taking one more look at that map though, certainly a lot more smoke than was showing up yesterday, but It'll be interesting to see what this looks like in about 6 or 8 hours as the winds pick up and some of that smoke starts to get pushed out of the area. So that ties into air quality, and you can see a perfect example of that. It shows very unhealthy to hazardous air around the Creek Fire and the Castle Fire. We also have some hazardous air up here by the Slater Fire, and if we look at the forecast for today, you can see what's expected. The winds are going to remain relatively weak in this area, so there is some unhealthy air throughout majority of the valley, I believe, and then also parts of Northern California associated with the Slater Fire and the August Complex. Now looking at the forecast for tomorrow, again, it's showing that the majority of California is going to be in that moderate range. Although weather conditions are favorable, I think there's still going to be a lot of smoke produced, so I'd be surprised if all of California is in that moderate to unhealthy for sensitive group range. Now, looking at that forecast for today, you see the main thing I noticed is this unhealthy area down working its way into Southern California, and that has to do with the winds right now. So you saw the Creek Fire and Castle Fire were burning and creating a lot of smoke, and the winds right now are acting to push some of that smoke south. For the most part, though, the winds are incredibly weak over this area, so that's what's allowing that smoke just to sit there. And then if we go forward throughout the day today, by this afternoon working into tonight, you see that the winds actually shift direction. They get more southwest, which is going to be affecting the northeastern sides of really all of our fires. So the next one I want to talk about is the Bobcat Fire. And this has been one of the top fires that I've been watching for the last week. And looking at the satellite imagery, I would say this looks a lot better than it does yesterday. We still see these two little plumes popping up, but overall that's a lot better than the huge plume was showing up yesterday on the satellite imagery. Now, the main thing that we've been talking about when it comes to the Bobcat Fire is those valuable resources up on Mount Wilson. So I want to do something new here and actually take a look at what we're talking about there, because I've been bringing that up for the last week, and I think it's helpful to actually look at it. So you see, this is the area of where the Bobcat Fire has been burning. We've got Pasadena, Arcadia down here, and if we zoom into Mount Wilson, you'll be able to actually see some of these valuable resources that the fire is actively threatening. It's been threatening for the last week, and it's getting dangerously close throughout the day, really yesterday, and it'll continue today. So if we zoom in here, you can see that observatory I've been talking about, as well as a number of other buildings in this area. And then if we go over to the left, you can see, while they're not 3D, you can see all of these towers. Apparently, every single TV station in Los Angeles has a tower up on Mount Wilson. And then there's also a ton of radio towers, as well as important communication and cell service towers. So that's why they're working so hard to protect this area. Now, one thing I'll point out here is how steep the hills around this area are, and that kind of ties into what I was talking about earlier with those up canyon winds. So here are all our resources, and during the day, right here will heat up, and then you get those winds flowing up the mountain. So that's what has been the main threat to these resources throughout the last week. However, I do know firefighters took advantage of some favorable conditions last night to actually burn out some of the vegetation around here so that if the fire moves up, there will be no more vegetation to burn, and there will be a nice little protective barrier around that. So pretty interesting things going on there. That's one of the key areas that I've been watching for the last week, and I'm going to continue to watch throughout the next 24 hours, especially as conditions are remaining tricky in that area. So let's actually go to the fire perimeter map so we can see what is actively burning when it comes to the Bobcat Fire. Now, zooming in here, again, this shows the fire perimeter and active fire growth, and you can see that area around Mount Wilson right here has a lot of active fire, and I hate to say it, but it's expanded a great deal from what it looked like yesterday. We've been getting some winds blowing from the east to the west in the morning hours. So that's been creating some spot fires. And you can see there's still some active behavior there. So that's one of the key spots I will be watching. Not sure what's going on with my map right here. All right, looking at the northeastern edge, this is another area I've been watching closely. You can still see there's some active fire growth in this area. Main reason for that is there's a lot of dry fuels, haven't burned in 60 years. So that is a main concern. I know this fire is threatening some of the containment lines here, and there's some higher populated areas around here. So that is another top priority. Where there is good news is on this northern edge and the southern edge, where you can see there's basically no hotspots remaining. And that's great because this was the top priority as it was actually starting to burn into some of these high population areas. So at least there's no more hotspots around here. And hopefully they'll be able to divert some of these resources to help out on Mount Wilson. So if we go to the Mount Wilson information, you can see it's up to 113,000 acres and it is remaining at 17% containment. I think the reason that number hasn't gone up in the last day is we do still have a lot of growth on that southwestern and northeastern side. So you can actually see where we do have some containment, like I was saying, on the northern edge, basically at 100% containment there, as well as the southern edge. And then this area of the east as well, but you do still see active fire growth on the northeastern edge that could be influenced by some of those winds today, and then around the Mount Wilson Observatory. And something I'll point out here that's important when it comes to these maps is you'll notice that it appears the fire has already burned past Mount Wilson Observatory. So that's an important thing to point out with this map. Just because there's a fire perimeter doesn't mean that 100% of the area in this perimeter has burned. So as we've seen with Mount Wilson Observatory, which last source I could find said all those resources are still protected, and let's hope that continues throughout the day today. So looking at the forecast, this is something to be very excited about. Today, 83 degrees, much lower than we saw last week when we had some triple digits, and it's actually getting down into the 70s on Friday. So that is exactly what we want to see. And honestly, I believe if they've been able to protect those Mount Wilson resources in the past 3 days and the past week when we had some really tricky conditions, I think with these lower temperatures, these lower winds, and these moderate humidities, they should be fine. Now, I will point out though, this humidity is something that is still a factor in this area. As you can see, it has a strong influence of that nighttime drying. It should be going up to maybe 60 or 80% at night, but you see, it's basically just a horizontal line all day, which allows the fire to burn 24 hours a day. And you know, it's not the teens or the single digits that we saw last week, but 22% and 20% is still a low humidity. And you can actually see that if we look at the humidity map here. The good news for Northern California, it's a lot more humid than it was last week, but Southern California remains in that dry air. And if we click through here, you can see that that dry air is actually going to be covering most of California, but again, especially that Bobcat Fire down in Southern California. So that dry air really remains the only real threat to a lot of our fires. We have some wind gusts, but nothing compared to what we've seen in the past, but the dry air does still remain. So the next one I want to talk about is the North Complex, and I want to point out the satellite image here first because this perfectly shows what's going on. You can notice this smoke plume in the north, the northeast, and then the south associated with the North Complex here. And you'll be able to see that perfectly when we go to the fire perimeter map. Now, it always takes me a little while to zoom up here. One thing I will say, CZU, SCU, and LNU lightning complex wildfires are almost at 100% containment. So if you need some great news, you can find it there. There's also actually some great news when it comes to the North Complex, and I would say that's been one with how great our containment numbers have been, and also this Northern Edge and Northeastern Edge have appeared to calm down in the last 4 or 5 days. You can see there are still some active areas though, that's why those smoke plumes were showing up on the satellite imagery, and it'll be interesting to watch these areas throughout the day today as those southwest winds start to test these north containment lines again. Now, the other thing I want to point out is this southern edge, and this comes back to those down canyon winds. So last night, the exact same thing that we've seen the last 2 nights here. There's a canyon and a drainage here. It cools off during night, and then we get those winds flowing down canyon, really leading to some rapid fire growth in this area. And you can see there are some more populated areas around this fire. So this is the number one spot that I'm going to be watching over the next 24 hours. Now, some more good news on this area around Orville. Basically at containment, there's no more hotspots. I know they've been talking about some repopulation efforts, so don't take my word for it. Always check the CAL FIRE website, but that is some great news there. So if we actually get into the numbers for the North Complex, you can see it officially reached over 300,000 acres. So like I said, there are still those 3 areas where there is active fire growth, and there could be some active fire behavior over the next 3 days, although for the most part, I'd say things are looking pretty good. And that is looking great. 75% containment is exactly what you want to see. And you can see that on this map. Majority of the north fully contained, almost the entire western edge is contained, almost the entire southwestern edge is contained, and then this perfectly shows we got that active fire behavior in the north, northeast, and the south with those down canyon winds. Now, the reason I'm feeling pretty great about the North Complex fire is at 75% containment, most of the fire is contained, and there's still a ton of resources to attack those remaining regions that are still burning. We got over 3,000 personnel, 62 crews, 26 helicopters, 232 engines, 79 dozers, and 80 water tenders. So out of all the fires, I'd say I'm feeling the best about the North Complex right now, as they'll be able to use a lot of these resources just to attack those remaining burning regions. And then the other thing I'll say that I forgot to mention, throughout the day, the winds are going to shift back up canyon. So firefighters will be able to come in, put out some of these fires right here, and hopefully get some lines in to protect these populated areas. So that's something I'll be watching throughout the day today. Now, when it comes to the forecast for the North Complex, this is probably the first thing that catches your attention, and I'll talk about that in just a second. You can see there are some warmer temperatures up here, but it's still around seasonal averages, and it should be hovering around the same temperature, if not going down, for the next 3 days. Now, I will point this out. There is a fire weather watch for Saturday and Sunday, and it shows that a heat wave could be coming in. I know that's the last thing we need right now, but I do have to mention this because it's something in the extended forecast that I've been watching closely. With that being said, I personally don't trust a forecast more than 3 days out, so take this with a grain of salt, but this is something to watch. There could be a new heat wave coming in with some gusty winds that could possibly lead to some rapid fire growth and possibly some new fires at the start of this weekend, working into early next week. Now, that's in the extended forecast, so don't worry about that too much yet, but I will explain the mechanism that is driving that and the thing I'll be watching to see if this event actually happens. It's this high pressure system over the Pacific here that's just working its way into California and the entire western US throughout Thursday, Friday, and then you see around Saturday and Sunday, it just pushes closer and closer to the California coast. And the exact timing of this event and the exact location and intensity are still up for debate. There's not a huge confidence in the models yet. So again, nothing to worry about yet, but something to keep our eye on. So had to mention that there. Also, when it comes to the North Complex, again, with all of our fires, temperatures much lower than last week, winds much lower than last week, could still see some gusts around 25 miles per hour on the ridges, but for the most part, I'd say we're looking pretty good. Will point out those winds are shifting very southerly today, so that's again where I said that we're gonna have these northern lines tested, but if they could handle the 40 mile per hour gusts we saw last week in the north, then I think they'll do fine throughout the day today and really the next few days. And then when it comes to humidity, we've been seeing much better recoveries in the nighttime hours, so that's been allowing firefighters to get a handle on some of these blazes. And for the most part, humidity is just much higher than it was last week. No longer teens and 20s, we're now in 20s and even 30s. So that's great news there. Alright, last fire I'm going to talk about is the August complex here. And you can see there is, or at least it appears to be, a lot more smoke than we saw yesterday. I believe part of the reason for that is just the winds are pretty weak right now, which is allowing some of that smoke just to sit over the area. Now, if we actually look at the August complex, you can see where some of those active burn spots are happening. And the first thing I'll point out is that the north looks a lot better than it looked yesterday and throughout really the last week. You can see a lot of those hot spots have been put out. I know firefighters have been working hard to get some good lines around here. There were some favorable conditions last night, so they were able to get some new lines in and put out, it appears they've put out some of these fires, but there is still some active growth on the southwestern edge here. You can see it's continuing to spread, and the main reason for that, there's some thick, heavy, critically dry fuels in this area, coupled with some really steep, tricky terrain that hand crews can't really get into. So around right now and yesterday morning, when the smoke is super thick, they can't get crews in to fight these fires because the terrain is bad, and then they can't get aerial operations in because the smoke is bad. Now, what we saw yesterday, and what I'm expecting to see throughout the day today, is that smoke will clear out, and then they'll be able to get those helicopters and aerial operations in here to put out some of these hot spots. So that's some good news there. With that clearing smoke, they'll be able to suppress this fire better. Now, when it comes to the numbers, again, number one largest wildfire in the history of California. We're now officially over 850,000 acres, working our way up to 1 million. Hopefully we don't get there. Containment is at 38% though, and containment is looking terrific on this eastern edge. You can see eastern and southern or southeastern edge are almost at 100% containment here, where there is still that fire growth again in the north and the southwest. But given that such a large portion of this is contained, that's encouraging because they'll be able to take some of those resources and just attack the southwestern edge. So that's what I'm looking at with all of these fires. If we take a wide view of what's going on, this is always something I like to point out, how bad this wildfire season in total has been. Over 3 million acres burned, by far the most in recorded history, and in our top 10 largest California wildfires of all time, the number 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6 have burned this year, and 3 of those are actually still growing. So that's something I'm going to continue to watch. I'd say, basic summary of this video, we've got favorable weather conditions over the next 3 days. Firefighters will hopefully be able to get some great containment on these fires, put some of them out, so that if that big fire weather event does happen this weekend, hopefully we'll be in a situation to deal with it. As always, thank you to CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service for all the amazing work you do, to San Jose State, Adam Kochansky, Dr. Craig Clements for teaching me basically everything I know about wildfire. And if you or any of your friends or family have been affected by these wildfires, my thoughts and prayers go out to you, and thanks for watching.